Hello, Maggie, and welcome back to the show.
Hello, it's lovely to be back. I've been looking forward to it.
Me too. Me too. It's a conversation that we didn't know we were going to have. The conversation. I was looking forward to the conversation, but now I know what we're talking about. I'm looking forward to it even more.
Well, we think we know what we're looking about, but we may resist it and go off on a tangent.
That's so true. So let's start right there. We're exploring this notion of resistance, but through a particular, I guess, lens and understanding, and quite a deep one, I'd say. So let's start with your definition of what, when we're talking about resistance, what's meant by it.
Well, to me, resistance is whatever it is that seems to be terribly attractive and has to be done right now, has to be done today, and it's your job to do it, and you should be doing it, and you must do it, and it stops you doing what your creative work is. Whatever your creative work is. And for some of us, creative work is healing, obviously. Some of us, creative work is crafting. For me, it's teaching and writing. And I can tell when I'm close to starting a new book by the levels of resistance that come up to stop me doing it. And I'm writing my 21st book now, and resistance still has me. So the first thing to understand is you never, ever destroy resistance. If you're still growing, it'll be there.
I love this. I love this. And what I find interesting about this way of talking about resistance, I think it's the almost like the unseen face of resistance. It often will relate to this idea of resistance is when we have this like very obvious, like, oh, like when it's procrastination or fear, something that we're kind of very clear, like, oh, I'm being called to this, but I feel this sense of like, oh, reluctance, I don't want to, rather than being tempted elsewhere as a form of resistance. So I think this is a really helpful place to start that illumination, because it is definitely a trickier place to see how resistance showing up, because it looks like we're taking action, it looks like we're doing something.
Yes, resistance is very cunning. It's very cunning. Sometimes I think when in the New Testament, when they talk about demons, I think it's all this kind of resistance stuff about how things drive you crazy when you don't do your work. And how utterly powerful it is. I've got a wonderful friend who lives down the road from us who does magical stuff with kinesiology and EFT, and helps particularly people with PTSD and people with fibromyalgia. He's incredibly good with them. And yet some of the people who've gone to him, he's always said you must do a little follow-up work with the emotional freedom therapy, because resistance will try and come back to you. And part of the problem that these people have is that they've got used to not being sick, not being well. And they don't even know that. This is always unconscious. It's never intentional. They don't realize that they've got what Caroline Myss would call woundology, which means that somehow what they have is benefiting them in stopping them doing their work. And this one particular girl who'd had fibro since the age of about 20, and she'd married 2 alcoholics in a row, and she'd never done what she really wanted to do with her life, which was simply crafting. And she was a very good crafter when she got round to it. And eventually she sort of lost contact with us. And I thought, that's interesting. So I followed up a few months later and said, how are you? And she said, and I said, are you doing the follow-up stuff? And she went, no. And I said, do you know why? I'm not judgment. I just want to know, do you know why? Because there's a reason why. And we talked for a while, and then suddenly she got it and she started to cry. And she said, if I'm well, I have no excuse not to look after my elderly parents.
Oh, wow.
And so she was actually juggling her health with her inability to say no to her parents, because she felt she owed them. And they've looked after her for so long. And she didn't feel that she thought if she were fully well, she might have to face up to telling them, no, I can't take care of you, I want to live my life. And she simply couldn't do it. And a lot of us have that kind of level of resistance, which is my duty.
So interesting, because the way that resistance and duty, well, all these different themes are so intertwined, aren't they? This, what you were naming is the way that we create, which I think another way of describing that would be to like do what our souls come here to do. This very deep, embodied sense of like generative force that's wanting to flow through from us, or flow through us. And then the way that resistance and duty are so intertwined, in that resistance can show up as duty, but also the way you're describing it, it's like the resistance is to then stop needing to be in conscious intimacy with the duty, which would then probably be the very thing that would keep her, in that example, keep her from whatever it is her soul's calling her to. And it's so interesting the way these two things, it's like sometimes it's the duty that we're very aware of, and sometimes it's the resistance that is kind of showing up in a different way that we're aware of, but it feels as though they're both creating that same temptation away
It
from
does,
our
because
soul.
resistance is cunning. You actually have to treat resistance as if it is a being. Almost as if it's not exactly a demon, but it's actually something that lives within you, that is powerful and strong and believes that it's right. It believes that it's helping you. It believes that it's keeping you alive. It believes that it's keeping you on a par with the tribe, which is where you are safe. Because if you run with the tribe, if you run with the pack, you're less likely to be picked off by predators. And it is that powerful and that basic and that fundamental. And it's, here's a phrase: we are not here to help others. We are here to shine, which will help others.
Yes, it reminds me of Clarissa, I can't get words out today, Clarissa Pinkola Estes passage. You might know the one where she talks about soul on deck, kind of like it acts as a beacon and catch light, like helps other souls catch light.
Yes.
And I absolutely agree. I see
and
that.
Anne Lamott follows that very same metaphor. I love this. She says, lighthouses do not run round islands looking for ships to save. Brilliant.
I love that so much. Yes. Yes, I really love that.
In fact, you know, I think I'm going to have to print that off and put it on my wall. And then my resistance will mean that after a day or two, I don't see it anymore.
That's the... I find myself marveling over and over again at how clever and how sneaky that happened. Like, whether it be me personally or whether it be with our clients, how, for example, I can say something directly and then I'll notice, oh, that's so interesting, they've not responded to that. And then it might be later that day, or sometimes I might even a few days later come back and say, did you see this thing that I said? And they're like, oh my goodness, it wasn't I intended to ignore. I absolutely just didn't see it. Yes. And I know they're telling the truth. It was just like the way that part of them just kind of blinded them to that, because it would have got in the way of them allowing resistance to continue to take hold.
Absolutely. If you're watching the video, you'll see there's two diagrams behind me, the Kabbalistic tree of life and Jacob's ladder. And it's absolutely fascinating how many people simply ignore them. They do either ignore them or do not see them. And they're rather weird paintings. And if you've got them in your living room, which this is my office, but we've had them in the living room as well, you'd imagine most people would go, what's that? But they just don't see them.
So interesting. Yes, it's like I don't know if you've watched the series Westworld. It was on a few years ago, and it's like half of the people in it, there's a whole backstory to this, but there's half the people, I guess, are like very humanoid androids, let's say. Like, they're indistinguishable from human beings, the AI, I suppose. And there's this phrase that they have whenever they see something that might allow them to know that they're not human, because they need to believe they're human. Whenever they see any sort of evidence, they say something like, I might know this completely right, but it's like, I can't see anything here. And it's so clever how that's literally programmed in. Like, I can't see anything here. It's just, there's like, no, whatever this evidence is that they're not human just doesn't even allow them to see it.
Yes.
And I feel like there is a version of that we're playing out over and over again. That's almost like, if it's something of the soul, if it's something that's going to take us on that path of soul, I don't see anything here.
Yes, because it's dangerous, the path of the soul. Well, the ego thinks it is, the amygdala at the back of the brain, which is still looking for saber-toothed tigers, thinks that any change or stepping out of the tribe is dangerous. And we think, oh, I've done this wonderful workshop, this is absolutely great, it's going to be amazing, it's going to be wonderful. And the back of the brain's just sort of going, slow down. Oh, look at that pretty flower. Or, oh, you should call your mother. Or, oh, you need to do this. And it's all so justifiably logical. The resistance is so sensible, but it does have should in it. You should call your mother. You should do this. I mean, just this morning, I have not meditated this morning. We didn't have an alarm today because I knew I was doing a podcast with you, which meant I wasn't going running. I usually go running on Monday mornings. And start of my resistance was, I'm not going to get up a half an hour earlier so I can go running, so I can be showered and fresh for Rebecca. So part of resistance 1. Resistance 2 had a bit of a lie. And resistance 3, should have done my meditation before this, thought, oh no, the birds are nearly out of food. They're not out of food, they're nearly out of food. So I went out to feed the birds, which got me distracted. And then the postman arrived. And it was all so, this is what I'm doing to run my house. It's all absolutely normal and perfect. But I didn't go running and I didn't do my meditation.
Yes. Oh, that's such a great example and such a good clue that notion of should is, one of those ways that we can kind of start to get like perhaps there's something to see here. And also going back to the fact that, like, if those of us that are here working as, whatever type of change worker, healer, guide, this is always going to be going on for us, and also showing up on our clients. And I find that fascinating, the way that we can either, when we're working with other people, we can either kind of like agree with the resistance, like, oh yes, no, that makes complete sense, you should be feeding the birds, ringing your mother. Or we can be that quiet voice that reminds them that their soul's saying something different.
Yes.
And that isn't always welcome. I'm sure you've experienced that. That isn't always welcome, because again, the part of us that says it's not safe is going to come back quite violently sometimes in response to that. Again, whether that be an internal response or whether it be the response of a client. So I'd love to know your experience of that, when you've been the one kind of like on the side of soul, gently sort of like suggesting, is there something to see here?
Yes, I can only really, the best example I can give is I've got a dear friend who's got the wall up about it. And every now and then I try very hard very gently to mention it. But basically, he was a musician. He's got 2 degrees in music, and he started composing. And he wrote 2 pieces of music which were actually quite critically well received. And then he stopped. And I said, why did you stop? And he said, because they weren't good enough. I couldn't be good enough. And I said, for whom? The critics liked them. And he said, oh, for me, I couldn't be good enough. So I stopped. And now this man, whom I love dearly, he's like a brother to me. He's become a teacher. He doesn't even teach music. His walls are absolutely laden with CDs. He has the best sound system in the world, and he listens to every single version of every single classical piece of music. And he's very snotty about things like Classic FM because they play film music and things like that. So he's now a professional critic because he won't do his work. And sometimes I say, well, why don't you just write a little bit more music or something? Oh, no, I'm not good enough. I'm not going to do it. And I can't get through to him. I mean, he's not a client of mine. He has been occasionally. But what is very interesting is he has a heart condition, which is a hardening of the fluid in the pericardium around the heart. So his heart is hardened. And he won't see it. He literally will not look at that. If you start even mentioning anything other than physical of his heart, this is a spiritual man. You know, he works and teaches spirituality as well as at schools, but he just literally shuts off to that. And there isn't anything you can do to change it apart from ruin the friendship. And my resistance is I don't want to ruin the friendship. So I've got some resistance to actually saying to him, you are wasting your life. And maybe I just have to do it and risk losing the friendship.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and the way that is showing up for you too. And I think that very much is something that there's an invitation for us in those relationships, in those dynamics, for us to be honest and intimate with how that's showing up for us. Just like you're saying, you know, what is it that we're not saying? What is it we're not doing because of our own resistance? I was just before you shared that example, I was thinking something that example speaks really well to, which is the way that when we aren't in that creative expression of our soul, the way that it can almost seem as though it's being kind of turned inwards, and often will show up in physical symptoms. And then I was also thinking, when you mentioned this too, the way that even those of us that are very open to recognizing the kind of like spiritual nature of, well, everything, and it's like suddenly in this place of resistance, oh no, not here. Like here there isn't a spiritual answer. Here it's suddenly, you know, like it's mundane and it's material, and you know, God doesn't get a look in here. Like that's fanciful to think there is some sort of way that there could be a spiritual opening here. We almost can guard it quite hard, can't we? You know, like fiercely, like no, not here.
I see nothing here. Yes, exactly. And the only answer is spiritual, as Einstein's meant to have said. You can't solve a problem with the same energy that created it. You simply can't. And everything, I'm always, to clients, I'm a little more firm with clients, and I'll just gently come back and say, and I always try and say and instead of but, because but always brings up a resistance. And when people are saying yes but, you know it's a resistance.
Yes.
Always, you know, perhaps you could think about doing this. Yes, but I've got to do the other. Yes, and you've got to do the other. So let's talk about timing here.
Oh, I love that. So let's go there, because there are, you know, those of us that are in any kind of relationship with the world, with other human beings, there are things that we have responsibilities for.
Yes.
Even the, you know, most basic things like taking care of our, you know, companion animals, walking them, feeding them. And so there are, you know, genuinely some material things that require attending to. And I love what you're saying here. It's like, yes, there's truth there. And
yes,
I'd love to hear you say a bit more about that, because again, it can seem particularly tempting to believe that all we've got time for, all we've got energy for, is those things that we're saying that are the important duties, the important shoulds.
Yeah.
And so what have you seen is helpful in opening us to see, like, there is the space for an and?
Well, I always go back to the saying of Jesus, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And then I refer it back to the Hebrew Testament with the laws of tithing, which are very, very clear if you know how to read them. And of course, that's the trouble. The Hebrew Testament was never meant to be just read by a single person. It was meant to be read out loud and compared and debated and talked about. And the ancient Hebrew had no vowels, so it was just the consonants. So you could use one word could mean a dozen things. So you had to debate it. But the laws of tithing, as I've worked them out for the present day, and my job as teaching Kabbalah is to update the tradition for today. That means that people from the past always dislike it because that's the way we are. But it's got to be updated for the day. And the way I've updated the tithing for today is to say it's very, very simple. Your first attention goes on your spiritual connection. Always the first attention has to be, am I connected? Always, with everything. The second has to be celebration, which is to ground it in you and experience pleasure and joy, to nurture you. And then third, you take care of others. That's what the tithing system is about. Connect, celebrate, give. Always. And I'm quite disciplined in, except for this morning with the meditation. But even so, when I woke up before we had our cup of tea in bed, which is our second thing, we have a cup of tea and a biscuit in bed, which is wonderfully decadent. But I say a prayer. I say a prayer of thanksgiving. Well, a little Lawrence Scovel Shin prayer, which I love. It only takes 30 seconds. But my first thing to do is say, thy will be done this day, dear Lord. Today is a day of creation. I give thanks for this perfect day where miracle follows miracle and wonders never cease. Thank you. And then I have my tea and my biscuit, and then we get up and feed the dogs and do the walking bit and do the other bit. And when I open my emails in the morning, I have Richard Rohr's Contemplations and I have Tut's Letters from the Universe. And I read those first before anything else. No matter how one email is screaming at me, oh, Sturkus, 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 Moritori sunt, she says carefully in Latin so as not to swear on your lovely podcast. And it's calling you. You can see that there's this email, but you've got to avoid it and go to this contemplation one first. And then if there's an email from a friend that's helpful, you go to that and you make yourself focus on it. And then you deal with the rubbish one. And to do that takes quite a lot of discipline because your eye is automatic. We are wired like Teflon for joy and Velcro for fear. That's the way the Amygdala is to save our lives. And you have to learn to have the discipline and say, I will do it in this order. And every point in the day when things go wrong or haywire or whatever, you have to, I have a little stone. It's a hematite stone, which I keep in a pocket. And it's fascinating because all the crystals that I have eventually start cracking because they start drawing the negative energies out of me, which is tough for them, but blessings for me. And I'll sort of put my hand in my pocket to get a tissue or something, and I'll feel the stone. It'll remind me, start again. Connect, tea or a treat, looking at the garden, looking at the birds, stroking the dog, something very simple, then start again.
I love this so much. I was, as you were, firstly, there was a synchronicity that in the book I was reading yesterday, that very phrase that you quoted from Jesus right at the beginning was mentioned, and in very much the same context as you've just had, as in like it's the bit that was often missed is the yourself part in it.
Yeah.
And it's without that, the rest of it kind of does become this hollow duty that isn't actually isn't connected.
No, but it feels good because you get your strokes from it, don't you?
Yes.
And one of the reasons we go into holistic health, and certainly the way I did, was my first husband died from cancer, and there were certain aspects about it which the medical health profession did not help, and they could have helped. And the only thing that did help him was healing. So when he died, this great thing rose up with me saying, I want to help make sure that other people don't have to go through this. And that's a very valid reason to going into healing, but it does not take care of you. And on the aircraft, whenever you're in an aircraft, they say quite clearly, if the oxygen masks come down, put yours on first before you help anybody else.
It goes back to what we were saying before we began recording about the wounded healer, and how you were saying the workshop you ran, was it Heal the Healer?
It was
Heal the
Caring for the Carers. It's the only workshop I've ever run when nobody booked.
And there is just yes, when we're so wired, for all the reasons we've said, to focus on others, take like my duty, I need to take care, and not realizing the way that we're getting some needs met in doing that. Yeah. But equally, we're not really getting those like deepest of needs met. The other thing that was occurring too, as I was hearing you speak, and I have similar practice in myself, that I think easy to overlook the importance of until we start having a conscious conversation, like little rituals I have where I might go and spend time on my altar every day, all of these different ways that are just wired in. But a little goes a long way. A drop of God goes a long way. Those like 30 seconds in your example of your prayer is like that. Is of course there is that conscious prioritizing of that, but it's quite short and sweet, and yet it goes a long way.
Yes, it does not have to be a 20-minute meditation every morning. You start off with just a moment of connection. Yes, the 20-minute meditation contemplation is going to be very, very helpful to help you sift the thoughts that are going through your head. I don't necessarily just sit with and tell my brain not to talk, because it's never going to listen to that. Anyways, there are moments, there are 5 minutes in each meditation when it is sublime, thank God. But most of it is sifting. Do I really think that? Do I really need that? What's going on in my brain at the moment? What thinks it needs to connect to where? What's going on? And then I'll just say, well, what do you think? And usually something will come back very, very clear and very, very simple. And it may be something utterly ridiculous. For example, the morning my father died, this was a long time ago, before we had internet and mobile phones. And I had a healing client coming to me who had to drive an hour and a half. And my father died at about 8:30 in the morning. I got the phone call, can you come to the hospital? Can you do this? This lady wasn't due till 11, but I went off to the hospital. Yes, there was a lot of grief going on, and we weren't expecting him to die. He was supposed to be having a heart operation, which was going to ensure he was okay, but he died on the way into surgery. So part of me knew when I knew that was meant he wanted to go. That was his time. But I was wise enough before I ran off to the hospital to think, I've got to take 10 minutes here, because this is going to be a very difficult day. And I sat down and did a meditation, and it said, eat breakfast. So I ate breakfast, and then I went off, and then about 10 o'clock, I realized, oh my God, I've got a client and I can't call her. I can't stop her coming. So I went home and said, I have to take 2 hours out now from dealing with my mother, my father had left my mother, so there was not that much problem there. In fact, she was quite glad he was dead, but we won't go into that at the moment. That was quite interesting to deal with too. But anyway, I went back home and I said, I'm knackered. Thank God I had breakfast, but I'm knackered and I have to see this person. Okay, 5 minutes, sitting on the sofa, going within. What do I do? And it was, what do I do? And the answer was hot milk and sugar. And I just thought, but I hate hot milk. And I don't want to eat sugar. But it was quite clear, hot milk and sugar. So I went to the kitchen, I made myself a hot milk and sugar, and it was exactly what my body needed to last for another 2.5 hours. So I think one of the things to do is always try and take that moment out and just say, what do I need? And give it up. And the answer will nearly always be unexpected, and the resistance will come straight in and go, but.
Yes. Gosh, this is it's a maze, isn't it? It's a labyrinth all the way through. It's all the way through.
And the voice will always be kind. If it's God, if it's your guidance, it will be kind. It will suggest. It will never should you. It will never blame you. It will never tell you you ought to have, because that's all the resistance. There's a lovely phrase, I don't know who first said it, but it said, if it's saying should, it's not God, it's your mother.
I love that so much. I really do. That really tickles me. I've noticed with my own guides, when they speak, they sometimes can be a little bit like sassy, a bit direct, but not at all in a kind of shamey making wrong way. Almost just like sometimes like a light-hearted teasing way. But
Yes.
very different, as you say, to a kind of like, you should have done this or you should do that.
Yeah.
There is very much a kind of fondness in
Yes.
the way that
And why aren't
guidance
you? Something like I had this weekend. We've got somebody to come and douse our house. I help douse other people's houses. I'm not very good at it yet, but the fact that I was dowsing other people's houses made me think, well, I should douse our house. And then I thought, well, it's like astrology. It's hard to do your own chart. That wasn't resistant, actually, because if you do your own chart, you can resist telling yourself stuff. And if you douse your own home, you can resist spotting things. So we found a lovely man who has been dowsing the house and doing some work this weekend. And I've forgotten my point now. So that's a lovely bit of resistance, isn't it? Oh dear. I completely forgot my point. But there was a point in there in that I was willing to hire.
I think where you led into it is just like, they might say like, almost like, why don't
That's
you do
it.
that?
That's it. And I was also thinking, well, what else can I do? Because I know I would need to get back onto doing some videos. I know I'm still resisting the book. I'm writing a bit, but I'm not writing enough. What's going on? And I said, what can I do? And the voice was very clear. And he said, you could try fasting again. And of course I was going, but we're coming up to Advent. There's lots of chocolate. There's lots of treats. There's mince pies. There's this, there's that, the other. And it said, you're not going to listen, are you? And I went, well, yes, I am listening. It said, how would you feel if I just went away because you aren't listening? And I went, I'm listening. And it was, but you're not going to do it, are you? And it was just very loving and knowing me very well. And because of that, the last 2 mornings I've done a 16-hour fast, which is perfectly good enough to start with, which means you don't eat anything after your supper until lunch the following day. And that a 16-hour fast is fine. But of course, we've got all the resistance on that, which is you should have a good breakfast, which is actually rubbish. Science has now realized you don't need a good breakfast. Yes. But we've been taught that for years and years and years. But I still will have a piece of protein if I'm going to go out and do a funeral or something, because one of my therapists told me I should have a piece of meat, fish, protein in the morning for my adrenal glands. So I will still tend to do that. But that's to support me. But as a general rule, I don't need the breakfast that I like to have every day.
So true. Such a great example of the way that these things can be. I think that the thread I'm seeing all the way through this is often what we're really being called to. Firstly, doesn't need to be something, like huge and drastic and like, entirely life disrupting. There can actually be quite small shifts, quite small little ways that we have those connections, opening to guidance, making changes. They're not the big things that the resistance is almost, it's like the resistance can be almost like a sledgehammer to avoid us, like, like it could be this tiny little thread that would actually be perfectly okay, perfectly safe, perfectly nourishing for us to pull on if we recognize like that's all that's being asked for here, but it will make such a difference. Yes. The other thing that I would like to, we've touched on this throughout, but I think it's a really helpful aspect to all of this to make more conscious is the role, like an example of the dowsing and the astrology. It often is so helpful to ask others to help us to see whatever is there to be seen.
Yes.
It's not, whilst the types of practices, those connection practices can really support us in seeing the resistance, I think for most of us, having someone else to help reflect that to us is invaluable. And I think, whether that's we're doing that for other people as, healers, change workers, but also for us too, to really allow that to into our lives in, allowing someone else to provide that role for us, is something that I don't know how. I don't think for many of us there is a way to replace that. I think we need that so much.
We do. And it's not only a courtesy to us, it's a courtesy to the other people, because it means we're running on full. And it means that our hearts are congruent with what we're saying.
Yes.
And one of the things I say to annoy people particularly is you can absolutely guarantee that when somebody tells you they're coming from the heart, they're not. Because a congruent heart does not need to inform you that it's coming from the heart.
Yes, that's so true. You can actually feel when the difference, can't you? Whether it's yourself or someone else, when there is that trying to give from a half empty cup.
Yes. I remember years and years ago, my ex and I were running a cafe in America, and we were not doing very well. And the manager, Delilah, turned around to me and said, "Your problem is you're all ego. Me, I don't have an ego." I think there's a little bit of projection going on there. I think we both have egos.
Oh my goodness. I'm really enjoyed and enjoying this conversation, and have this sense of, there's just so much more to journey with here, but we are almost up on time. I'd love to hear your sense of this. What we're talking about here is again, huge. It is this constant labyrinth of thinking, I've seen it. I've seen the way resistance is showing up, and then we think we've dealt with it, and then it's popping up a different way. You've given different examples of how you recognize that in yourself and how you journey with it. Is there anything else that you think would be a really helpful way of listeners, and again, listeners who are working with this, internally, like we all are, but also serving others in this work? Is there anything else that you think would be helpful to offer as a practice of a way of recognizing and working with resistance as it shows up?
I think it's important to realize that actually, to the heart, suffering is only caused by a contradiction of our ego's opinion. And actually, it's really useful when I'm hacked off with somebody. If my husband annoys me or something, is literally to say, this is my ego's opinion. Is there actually anything going on here that I need to be troubled about? And the answer is always absolutely not. And it takes a while to put this into huge situations like the situation in the Middle East at the moment, because we're all going, no. This should not be happening. But in fact, this is the next round of a long karmic cycle. And a huge shift of consciousness are needed here. This is basically two brothers at war. This dates back to Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, when Ishmael was sent away from the tribe and Isaac stayed in the tribe. This is a karmic battle that has gone on forever. And even if Israel were able to kick Palestinians out, that's not going to work, because the Arab nations will still hate Israel. It's got to be dealt with at a different level. So our suffering around it and going, it's awful, which it is not helping. What we actually have to do is say, I am a change worker, a light worker, a healing. I am sending healing to this situation every single night, because that's my job. There's something out there which is not, in my opinion, good, but God knows better than I that this is a cycle that's going on. What can I do? I can send good wishes and healing. That is my job. So it's our job to send light, but we're not going to do that if we get bowed down in our ego's opinion about it, because our ego's opinion about it is this is terrible and one side is wronger than the other side. So I think always it's a question of saying, be the watcher of your own thoughts. Just say, I am thinking this. The second you can take a step away from your actual thoughts and saying, this is what I am thinking, then you detach very slightly from it and you can see it from a different point of view. And the simple question is, can I do anything about this situation? No. Move away and allow a space for somebody else who can. Can I do anything about this situation? Yes. Then I will strengthen myself and I will do it. End of matter.
And all of that only is only something that's kind of in alignment with our soul, in alignment with God, when we have like come back to connection, come back to our hearts.
Yes. Yes. Is this my business? Byron Katie, I think, said there's God's business, my business, and everybody else's business. And most of the problems of the world are because we're in everybody else's business.
Yeah.
50 years ago, we still wouldn't have known what was going on in Israel. It would have taken, 100 years ago, it would have taken that long for the information to reach us. And we are utterly overwhelmed with all this news. So I say to people, okay, you're concerned about this. Are you praying? Are you sending healing? And if not, why not?
Thank you, Maggie. This has been another just really nourishing and opening and connecting conversation.
Yeah, it's gone by in a whistle, hasn't it?
I know it has. It really has.
Well, it's lovely to talk to you. And I also just want to mention how important it is for us all to know how different we are. We are both in England, which is a small island, and the weather where you are is very similar to the weather where I am. You are wearing almost summer clothing, and I'm sort of all bundled up to the neck. That's because we're wired differently, and it's okay. It's absolutely okay. And this morning I was drawn to a piece in Acts, which basically said, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. From one blood he made all nations that they should inhabit the whole world. And he determined the time set for them in the exact places where they should live. And I would take that loud, say he designed every single one of us from one blood, but we're all different. But we're one blood. We're one blood in God. We will come from one child, which in Judaism is Adam Kadmon, the primordial human being. We are all cells in that one body. So if we don't take care of us, then the poison in us will start to affect the whole body.
I love this way to close on this conversation, because again, everything we're talking about here is really about that expression of our own unique soul, and all the ways that it gets in the way of that, including this sense that it needs to be something different to than what it really is. So I absolutely love that, bringing us back to that. That's really all it is, in quote marks. It's as simple as that, but as challenging as that. But conversations like this, I think, help remind us.
One final thing you can say to annoy people, but it's very effective too, is whenever somebody says, I'm only one person, what can I do? Add the phrase, said 7 billion people.
I love your recommendations of how to annoy people.
You have to face up to the fact you're going to annoy people sometimes.
I I think that's one of the ways that you know that you're kind of like really doing the work. It's that willingness to annoy, not intentionally, not going out to, but that it will probably involve a bit of that too. Yeah.
And also understand that when people annoy you, it's important. The amount of times somebody said's really annoyed me, or the first time I stuck my nose into Louise Hay, you can heal your life, it really annoyed me. And Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, I threw that across the room, and then I sat there and looked at it and said, oh God, now I know I really have to read that book.
Yes, so well said, so well said. Yeah. Maggie, you've been wonderful. Where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful work?
Well, I have two websites, maggywhitehouse.com, Maggie with a Y, but Google will pick you up if you spell it the wrong way, and treeofsapphires.com. And also I'm on social media. I've got a YouTube channel. You can always find me. I've got a Wikipedia page because I wrote a sensible book about Opus Dei at the time of the Da Vinci Code. So they put up a Wikipedia page for me, which is terribly impressive. But there you go. You can find me.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you too.